Welcome to the Code for Couples podcast, focusing on topics for law enforcement officers and couples to keep you and your relationship connected, resilient, and code for. Now, your host, law enforcement expert Cindy Doyle, author of Hold the Line, and my wife.
Hey there, welcome back to Code for Couples. I am Cindy Doyle, your host, law enforcement spouse, and licensed professional counselor, author of Hold the Line. Today, I have Stephanie Conn on. I love Stephanie Conn. She is an amazing clinician. She teaches nationwide. She has an amazing book. I'm going to read her official bio because if you don't know who she is, you are going to want to know who she is when we're done. So Dr. Stephanie Conn is a former police officer. She is the daughter of a police officer. She is the wife of a police officer. I think everybody in her family is related in law enforcement somehow. She currently works as a licensed psychologist in her private practice, first responder psychology, where she specializes in police stress, trauma, work-life balance, coping, and resilience. She actually began her career as a dispatcher before becoming an officer with the Fort Worth Police Department, and then she earned her doctorate in counseling psychology. She presents nationwide, probably internationally at this point. She presents widely to emergency responders. She shares wisdom from her police experience, her research, and her therapy practice. You hear like our common ground here, right? And then she supports police and fire agencies, peer support, CISM teams, and does a lot of resilience training. She is also doing a training called ASAP across the country to help train up peer support teams. And I'm going to try to get her to talk a little bit about that before we go today. And finally, she is the author of an incredible book. And when I was writing my book, it was one of my favorite resources. And it's called Increasing Resilience in Police and Emergency Personnel, Strengthening Your Mental Armor. This is the old version, and she is rewritten it. She's coming up with an updated version, which is what we're going to talk about today. It's just an incredible book with a wealth of information. If you think research is boring, you won't when you read her book because she makes it so easy to read. So anyway, Stephanie, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Having me.
Is there anything about your background that you want to share with people that I didn't talk about? I know that you work extensively with departments. You are in, I always get this wrong, Washington?
Oregon. I mean,
I knew I was wrong. Okay.
No,
Oregon,
but I'm licensed in both states because
Okay,
Portland is right on the border of Washington. So I've got contracts up in Washington and do some work up there. And so I can go back and forth. So I'm licensed in both. So yeah.
So you're doing that and you have a group practice now with several people working with you, contracts with those departments and the peer support. And you're also married to an officer. You have family still here in Texas too, I think.
Yes. Well, my dad has since passed and my husband, who is an officer, has since medically retired following a car accident. So he's since retired from policing for medical reasons. And so, but I still have friends in law enforcement in Texas, which I consider family, right? So a guy I went to the academy with, I regarded more as a brother than an academy mate. And I still, actually, I've kind of replaced him with his wife. And now me and his wife are actually best friends. And so, which he's given me grief over, but that's, what are you going to do? No.
It's so good. But let's talk about the book a little bit. I want to know what the inspiration of this book was. Let me kind of tell people in general, this book is got a lot of information. It's research based, but your personality comes through in this book. The way you interpret things, the way you say things is kind of like, oh yeah, I get it. So how did the original book or the idea for the book come about?
Well, I had been writing a column for a police magazine for about, I want to say 3.5 years. And so every month I would write a little blurb. Hey, here's some tips for this issue, relationship issues or trauma issues or sleep issues or what have you. And I was getting messages from people saying, I sure would like for you to put it all in one place. And so I, instead of this kind of blurb of the month and they happened to get it or missed it that month or what have you. And so I thought about it because I was finishing my PhD. And so I had nothing else to do. As you know, you finish
I
school, you're
understand that.
like, I'm so used to just doing too much. What do I do with this extra energy I have? And so I just said, and I literally hadn't even gotten my degree in the mail. And I wrote up I looked at some publishers and I was like, what's the process for making a pitch? And I made a pitch, and I want to say it was within 24 to 48 hours. I had the editor. I said, you have a great idea. Here's what we want to do. And I thought this was going to be like months and I was going to hear anything. But I had followed the instructions, as I tend to do, and said, hey, look, there's a gaping hole that in this profession around these types of resources and what I'm hoping to offer. So I was very surprised to have such an eager, and I still have the same editor, which is interesting because after all these years, because that was back in 2015 when I actually pitched the idea in the first place to my publisher, and I have the same editor, 10 years later. So who did similarly with the new edition. But that was the idea, is to put it all in one place as a resource among many that, later came along, and to give people something to go back to look at, which is what's been interesting, because I've had people over the years tell me they bought my book because they heard it was good or they thought it would be good, and they just didn't have time to pick it up. So it sat on their nightstand. And then one day, after collecting much dust, something hit the fan and they picked it up and said, oh, shit, I needed it then. I'm glad it was sitting on my nightstand, which is such a funny thing. It's almost like a backhanded compliment. I bought your book, but I didn't feel like reading it for a long time. And then I did. And then I found it helpful. And you're like, well, I have very mixed feelings about that, but okay.
Yeah. It's kind of like the Gilmartin book, right? When, people are like, oh yeah, it's in my desk drawer, it's on my nightstand. And then it's not until later somebody picks it up and goes, why didn't I read this at the beginning?
Yep.
So, yes.
Oh yeah. And I have those too, right? I mean, none of us are immune from that. I have books in here and I'm like, I don't want to be a book collector. I want to actually read that. I'm going to get to that one. And so I'll go and look when I have some spare time and go, time to start this one.
Yeah.
Right. So guilty.
I'm a little bit of a collector too. Tell me, so increasing resilience, is there a personal connection for you in regard to the resilience? What do you think? Was it just the gap that you saw, or was there something else that sets you on fire about resilience training, the recovery aspect?
Well, everything about it is personal, because I grew up in that household and seeing my dad and never diagnosed, never sought treatment, never, had anything like that back in the time when my dad was an officer and was alive. But as I've retrospectively diagnosed him with having post-traumatic stress disorder between his military and then his almost 40 years in law enforcement. Because I just remember as a kid, I would have to walk when I would need to wake him up for some reason, that I would have to do it from a distance. And I even had like a wire hanger. This is back in the day of wire hangers and sticks or something like that. And I would actually kind of touch him from a distance, because if you were standing, I learned very early, you don't stand over him when you wake him up. And so from a distance, I would wake him up. And so I think there's a part of me that is inspired by those moments as a kiddo. And then there's, and I tell this story often when I teach on police identity disorder, which is, I guess, a kind of a term I somewhat coined, is that the last time I talked to my dad the last time I talked to him in person before he died was 4 months before he died, when I went home to visit him for his 70th birthday. So he did not live very long. Is he was very tearful as he talked about his regrets as a parent, as a father. And he said, I did the best that I could, because he had prioritized work over home life and parenting and all that kind of stuff again and again and again. And my dad didn't cry at his mom's funeral. And I remember as a kid seeing that, wondering, why is he not crying? I was very confused. But he cried 4 months prior to his death because he was so riddled with regret around not making a different choice earlier in life. And then, so it was very personal in that regard. And that was part of what stimulated the research I did on what keep officers or firefighters from retiring when they're able to. And it was the same stories again and again and again. And so those kinds of things lit me up. Even, and I've told the story before, and I probably said it the last time I was visiting with you on your podcast, is that I got out of policing, not because I didn't love it, but because one of my coworkers was killed in the line of duty. And we had had a changing of the guard from a police psychologist to a city psychologist that wasn't versed in first responder culture. And I had a lot of people asking me about who was out there that understood them because they were struggling with this issue or that issue. And I made the very carefully considered choice to step out and fill that gap. And so in some regards, every time I sit down with a person, even if I've never met them before or I write and I know I'll never meet them, it's for those coworkers or for that father or that friend or even my own, demons I've had to tangle with. That's who I'm thinking of. And so it is very personal. And I know we're supposed to have, all these professional boundaries and I do have professional boundaries, but I think it's what fuels the passion and makes it a passion and actually fuels the philosophy of my practice more than a job or a career or a way to make a living, because there's plenty of ways to make a living. And I could actually make a better living doing other things with my degree with less 24/7 kind of demands.
Yeah.
I'd never do it because it wouldn't have the same meaning.
It's part of the legacy, I think, when you or me or other people that do this feel inspired to connect or help other people understand what maybe we didn't know.
Oh.
It starts off, for me at least, and I think for you too, it starts off like, I think I can make a difference here. And then as you have gone along, what I see is the legacy that you're leaving behind, the legacy in how you're training all these people on certain techniques. Oh, I'm going to get emotional. The legacy that you're leaving behind in regard to the people that you touch, the clients, but then also just the message that you have. And that's kind of what you're saying. And I know part of that, we're going to talk about in a minute, but part of that legacy even kind of comes into your book as well. You mentioned, what did you say? Police identity
Disorder.
disorder. What? I'm so curious. Now I have to ask about that because I think you did coin it. What is that? What is that? Tell us.
Yeah. So it's interesting because when I was doing my research and I was doing research on what keeps people from leaving the profession, if they're like fun, at that point where they can retire. And I got some of the standard answers. I still feel a sense of passion for my work, or I've got kids in college, or I need the health insurance. I got, some of the normal answers we would all expect. But I'll tell you one that punched me in the throat. And these are recorded like official search interviews. Is I actually had a firefighter say this to me after telling me that, he was married. His first wife didn't tolerate his marriage to the job, so he got rid of her. And I was like, oh, whoa, okay. And he said that this one, she tolerates my marriage to the job, so I keep her around. And I remember thinking, gosh, you should write Hallmark cards. That's just pitter patter, right? That's so touching. I thought, oh my gosh, yeah. But, as he's telling me that, and he's already told me that he's married and has kids and he goes to church and he's got that community and this stuff. And then when it got down to the question, what keeps you from leaving the profession? He said, I don't want to go from a hero to a zero. And I was like, wait a minute. So all those things, his parent, being a parent, being a spouse, and being involved in the church community all amount to a zero. And that is stunning. And so what I found, and I did a handful of firefighters and then more police than that, is that it was that identity. I don't know who I am, or I don't have a way of identifying myself outside of this work. And in North America and other parts of the world, our work identity is central to everything. You meet people at a party and they're like, what do you do for a living? That's the first thing that comes out of your mouth. And other cultures, it's what's your family name or where do you come from? Right. So it's really more family based than work based, but that's just not how our culture is and how other cultures are around the world. And so when people will not leave the profession or struggle to leave the profession, and we see the suicide rates go up, when a person's sole or predominant identity is that police or that first responder identity, it becomes a disorder. And I've had people say, gosh, I'm really conflicted about you using that because that can be weaponized. It can be used against us. And I'm like, I'm just naming what's already there, right? I'm not creating something. I'm just giving it a name. And I think when we can name it, we can tame it, to borrow from Dr. Daniel Siegel's work. And if we can name this is what it is, and we can talk about how it shows up, even in young people, even in young first responders who came from that first responder family, And so while they might have some cultural norms around, a job is just a job and you should got to take care of you, they can't wash away the impact that their family upbringing
Right.
and lifestyle put on them. So, or kind of programmed in them.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's nice in a way to have sometimes labeling things or identifying it in that way is like, oh, that's an easy way to kind of encapsulate what's going on and what becomes toxic because
Yeah.
of that thought process and what can be corrected through resilience and kind of
Yes.
identifying something outside of the job. I know when my husband retired, he struggled with answering that question, like, what do you do? And I've even had other friends that have said, like, have semi-retired, what do you do? And and I've
Mm.
coached him. We've worked together, and now he says, whatever I want is what he says to the
Yeah.
answer to that question. He's like, I do whatever I want, and mostly I, do these things, but I
Yeah.
have fun. I get to decide what I want to do. But that's so the identity of it and the I'm gonna say the authority that comes with that job is a little bit intoxicating,
Oh,
that you can
yeah.
have that control, right? And so kind of depersonalizing from that can be difficult.
And even, yeah. And I talk about it, how it's problematic when you retire, but it's also problematic while you're on the job too.
On the
Because,
job. Oh,
yeah. And
yeah.
I've even seen one of your podcasts, but authoritarian spill over into relationships. Right. And
Mhm.
so where that first responder comes home and is still in that work role, right? Which
Yeah,
goes over
absolutely.
like a turd in a punch bowl. It's not good. It's really
Right.
not good.
You wrote this book in 2000 no, you pitched it in 2015, you said.
Yes.
And when did it come out?
2018 is what it came out in
2018. Okay.
2018. And so, which is to say that I started writing it in 2016, 2017, because it took a little while to get the contract done and signed and, that kind of business. And so I wrote it through some of 2015, 2016, and 2017. And so it
Mm.
launched in 2018. Yeah.
And now you have revised and updated.
Yes.
What shifted or what said, "You know what? I think it's time to do a revision."
Yeah, there was a lot of things. I mean, I think the most obvious 2019, 2020. I don't know
Mhm.
if we even need to say any more about that, but I will, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, just these big civil disturbances, these big issues around the Great Resignation, where a lot of officers that were just like, forget this,
Mhm.
even other first responders, forget this, I'm out of here. And then you ended up having this kind of a dwindling base of people applying for the job or seeing it as a viable job or respectable job or those types of things. And so it created a whole host of issues that we hadn't seen. I mean, we had seen it in some level in different points in history, but this was pretty significant, especially,
Mhm.
the civil unrest following George Floyd that just was on the heels of COVID. And we're just like, oh my gosh, it's the 1-2 punch. And I think I actually referred to it as the 1-2 punch of COVID and then the George Floyd protests and riots. And so it created a whole host issues in terms of like moral injury and burnout. And, he's trying to do more with less. And I did a presentation the other day that said the cost of doing more with less is more, right? And because
Mm.
it's a bigger impact on the officers and the firefighters that are already tired because they're mandatory to overtime all the time. And then they're handling higher call volumes, and then the violence rates have gone up. So they're seeing greater levels of trauma at higher volumes. And so you
Mm.
have greater likelihood of cumulative post-traumatic stress disorder, which is part of it. But really, I don't think my previous edition talked about things like moral injury and moral distress and burnout to the same degree that I'm talking about here. And so part of it was some of the demands changed, some of the challenges changed on the profession. But then keeping with the strengths-based component of and the strategy-based component of the way that I write is I also wanted to really incorporate a lot of the advances in what we had learned about resilience. The technology for us to even look at what it means to be resilient and to see if we're actually being resilient. And does this breathing technique work or not work and why, and how long does it take? So many explosions in terms of the technology for us to examine our resilience and be self-reflective and use these types of tools. I wanted those in there. I wanted some of the advances. There's so many weird terms. I almost wrote them down so that I'm going to forget them all because there's so many of them. But neurocardiology, and it was neurocardiology was there, and sounds like very like difficult to read, but I promise it's not. No, I mean, it is this. I was reading on the plane and I was like, someone's going to think I'm really smart if they look at these graphs that I'm trying to make fucking sense out of. Right. I look like I'm super smart on the plane here.
Right.
But, I was like, okay, I got to Google what that means and that means. So anyway, I write it in a simple way, but neurocardiology, do we understand how our heart rate patterns and heart rate variability affect our thinking and our thinking brain? And how does that affect our mental health? And how does that affect our performance, and the nutritional psychiatry? And I talked a little bit about, how your nutrition affects your mental health and sleep and libido and all these other types of things, quoting some of the work of Dr. Umana do. But I even have a better understanding of it now, and gut health and gut brain and that kind of stuff. And so in trying to make those things accessible to people as here's many tools that we now better understand, and then here's technology that helps us see that those tools actually work. And so we can be better champions of our own resilience rather than always going to, I hate to say this, always going to clinicians. How am I doing, doc? Right. And,
Right.
and then that's the other thing is some of the other advances that I put in there is that not only do we have staffing shortages in the first responder profession, but we have significant staffing shortages in the mental health profession.
Yeah, we do.
Because the demand for services go up, but the clinician volume and quality don't necessarily go up, then we find ourselves where demand is outstripping supply. And so what are the ways that we are going to better equip individuals to have tools in their own hands, or in what ways do we better equip peer supporters to task shift and task share for some of these resilience pieces and trauma recovery pieces for someone that either can't get in to see a clinician or wouldn't even ask?
Yeah. So, gosh, there's so much. Let me go backwards, I think.
Yeah.
So part of this is the idea of empowerment, that
Yes.
this book, the research, and totally agree with what you've written. It gives you information to maybe identify, oh, maybe this is what's going on with me. Maybe this is what's happening. The idea of moral injury is something that, in my opinion, I'm interested what you think, that since 2020 or 2021 has been talked about more and more. And I found the idea of moral injury, and that was back in 2020. And I think we talk about that more and more, and people are starting to identify of like, oh, this is part of what I'm experiencing. And once they identify that, then it's like, okay, well, what do I do about it? And so the book, the revision too, that's coming out is about like, hey, how can you empower yourself to be able to help identify part of what's going on? The science, which is always important, right? What's the science behind it? It's not just a bunch of woo-woo.
Right.
And what do I need to do? How does the science, how does doing, I'm going to say breathing because it's easy. How does this breathing technique, or how do these techniques work? How does my gut health impact things? And how do I actually know it's working? And so there's science and techniques that you can use, or that are in the book too, to help somebody understand and have backup. I'll use that word.
Yeah.
To know that something's moving around. And I love the fact that you mentioned the shortage of mental health, and mental health clinicians that work with first responders are culturally competent, are good. So it's bridging. The book is helping to bridge so many different things there. I know there's all different kinds of techniques too that have like mental health changes and the way that we help people. And I know we're going to talk about that in a minute. So all of that is in the book, being able to identify it, looking at the research, which I think is so important when you're looking at first responders. They want to know, like, what are the facts and not the woo? And then how do you take the woo, I'm going to say it that way, and apply the science in order to help heal thyself? Doesn't mean that sometimes you don't maybe benefit from talking to somebody else. And at the same time, you can take some of this on yourself to be able to take care of yourself and incorporate resilience on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Is that a fair
Yeah.
assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said activated a couple things in me, because I'm like, and I've considered making this my training title, is from woo woo to whoa. And taking something that is woo woo, right? This breathing, this meditation, this visualization, we're twisted up like a pretzel and wearing, really expensive workout clothes, no, okay, whatever. So I'm looking at the technology and whoa, the feedback that it's giving me is there's something actually here. This isn't just because sometimes we don't feel a change in the moment. And I tell people oftentimes, you can go to the gym and you can lift weights and you may not leave the gym saying, I think I built a muscle here. I just saw it in the reflection in the mirror as I walked by, or the window as I walked by. Because you always know you look when you walk by, especially when you're in the gym, right? But it doesn't mean it's not happening on the inside. And we can't feel those microscopic tears in the muscle fibers and that kind of stuff, but it doesn't mean that they're not occurring. Well, the same thing is true with the breathing exercise. You may or may not feel it at the moment, or may or may not feel dramatically better, but it doesn't mean it isn't changing things internally, that the state change, which may or may not be felt, becomes the trait change with repetition. And the technology is the whoa, because you're like, oh, wait, there is actually something. And it's very fascinating because I did this a few weeks ago I was training some dispatchers on getting unstuck from trauma when stuck at the console, right? And I said, we're going to do some breathing stuff. And we did some breathing stuff. And it was kind of funny because I marked the time on my watch when we were doing all of our breathing stuff. And then I came back the next day and showed them my HRV as recorded on my phone during that time. And I said, check your because I showed them how to check it on their phone. I said, check your HRV between 2:30 and 4 yesterday and tell me, do you see any differences, right? And that's the thing, is I want you to see, because there's certain technology and I can actually show you in real time how it's changing. And I showed them that device as well. But I want you to use your own phones, because you have your own phones and your own smartwatches. So you can check it at a later time. And
that's awesome.
Yeah. And it was really fascinating because one person came up to me on the break. I'm speaking in generalities here, of course. You don't know where I was and this kind of stuff, but said, I told myself before that I was doing a breathing break whenever I was stressed. I wasn't. I was just breathing. You're actually having us breathing. And and that's different. And I said, exactly, that it's different. And so now that you know what that feels like, and you know the difference between I'm breathing and I'm breathing, right now you know that. And so, and then coming back to the other piece is, you're talking about science and strategies, that's my philosophy, my philosophy of providing information. I want signs, so you know what it looks like. I want the science, so you understand why it looks like that, and the adaptive reasons why, because we love to label symptoms or signs as weaknesses rather than information, and that comes out of a survival, a mechanism in the body. So signs, science, and strategies. And because what I have seen is there are oftentimes science and signs discussed, and everybody feels trauma bombed at a conference and goes out in the parking lot, head down, because they're just like, that's me. And now I know why I'm fucked up. And they don't really, there's not as much of an emphasis on the strategies, and the signs aren't discussed in such a way that you understand the positive intention of the signs, the positive intentions of the symptoms. And it drives me fucking crazy that people do not get that strength space. Your intrusive images that you have on that call is it really sucks, but it's for very good reason. Embrace it,
absolutely,
recognize it, go with it. Let's get it worked through. Drives me crazy that we don't talk about that in that way.
And in my brain, I'm just saying, I'm like, yes, preach, because that's really like, it's that same kind of thing where I totally agree. It's like, what is happening? Why is it happening? And how do I correct it? Is kind of how I think of it. But I love your acronym there, your flow.
Alliteration.
Right? Alliteration. That is a better word.
A fancy word. Yeah.
That's a fancy word. That's a PhD word. But I think you are right. And that's part of why the content in your book is so important, that it's not just like, hey, here's how you're fucked up, right? This is, you're doomed. But it's also like, what do I do about it? And how do I correct it? It's the empowerment that, even though you're being impacted, it doesn't mean that you're a victim to it. You can take that and you can say, I have the autonomy to be able to, or the authority, whatever you want to use, to be able to address that, take this as information and go. So I love it. There's so much. This is why, guys, I always say everybody has to get Stephanie's book, because there is so much good information in there. Mine is a little worn and ragged and highlighted, and I happen to have it signed by Stephanie in here. So I cannot wait to get the new one. So your cover is inspiring, but it's not inspiring in the sense of like, oh, you see it and there's emotion that I think is evoked if you look at the cover. And then you told me, oh, there's more to it. And will you share the story about your cover? Because I think people need to know that.
Yeah. Oh, I want them to know that. It's actually, there's a blurb about it within the book itself. And it's kind of interesting because you're involved in this. And you may remember this from the conversation we had in Nashville, is when I was, I'd finished the content of my book. And so I was looking at some of the details in terms of, okay, what cover do I choose? And my publisher says, oh, go to Getty Images and pick something that's there and put it on the cover that you like. And this, you're knowing where I'm going with this. And I kept looking at it. I was like, this is just dumb shit. This is so stupid. It's actors putting on uniforms. It looks tacky. It looks phony, or it's outright offensive in some regard. And then I found one that I was like, that's good. It's not offensive. It's not hacky. And then I was looking up something. I think I was referencing your book or your podcast or something. So I had to go to your website. And I said, crap, it's on your website. So the very one that I had just kind of, and I'm not insulting your website.
No, I don't hear it. It's like,
I had just
the one image that wasn't offensive is the one we both agreed upon.
I was like, it's okay. And I looked at it, I saw it on yours, and I was like, crap. Okay, it's front and center on your, and I was just like, no, I don't love it. And then I was on Facebook, and, I saw the image of my former coworker, Billy Randolph. He was killed by a drunk driver, August 12th, 2024. And his wife, Lisa, and several of my coworkers all had this image of Billy, the last image taken of him 19 minutes before he was struck by the drunk driver, taken by a coworker, Nadine. Even my heart's starting to race as I'm talking about it. She had taken that photo of him and a couple of officers that were standing there with him, and not knowing it was going to be the last photo taken of him after 29 years of service. And one of Lisa's family members had taken the photo and really wanted to create it into something special. And so had kind of colorized it a little bit, had made kind of Billy front and center. And when I looked at that photo on Facebook, and I was like, I looked at it differently. I was like, oh my God, this has to be the photo. It has to be the photo. I worked with Billy. Billy served his community, served in the same department that I did. And he served there for 29 years. And this has to be the photo. This has to be the photo. It has to be the photo. Even as I talk about it, it's upsetting. I mean, it's upsetting, and it's also moving in a very positive way. And so I was just like, holy shit, do I reach out to Lisa? Is this offensive? Is this honoring him? I don't know. So I just wrote this very nerve-wracking message to Lisa. And I just said, if this is offensive in any way, just please know I worked with Billy. This is only meant to be in honor of his memory and in honor of his service. And she replied, yes, absolutely. And I said, okay, well, now I got the awkward stuff of like, who took the photo, owns the photo, and that kind of stuff, because my publisher's going to want to know all that stuff. And so she connected me with Nadine, and Nadine said, absolutely. Both of them without hesitation said, absolutely. It would be a great way to honor Billy. And it's funny because even now, and my husband's like, are you sure you want to do that? Because you look at the photo and you get emotional about it. And I said, damn right I do. I do want to do that. But it is bittersweet because I look at that and I think, what a way to honor a person. But at the same time, I think what an unnecessary loss of an officer. And Billy's not an isolated event. He just happens to be somebody that I knew. And I remember telling my husband, Perry, the other day when it first showed up on Amazon, the photo showed up on Amazon, and I think Lisa had posted it on her wall on her Facebook, and I said to Perry, I said, I never would have imagined when I worked with Billy that one day, many, many years later, his photo would be on the cover of my book and I would have written a book and I'd be where I am and what happened to him would have happened. I just never would have imagined that.
Of course.
And here we are.
Yeah.
So that's it. That's the meaning. And I have yet to tell the story without being moved in such a way. I mean, which I think is why it should be there.
Absolutely. It really is first of all, I didn't know that's who it was. I remember hearing about that on the news because, I'm in Dallas-Fort Worth area. Also, just that story in itself, you talked at the beginning about your dad. Oh, I'm going to get emotional. You talked at the beginning about your dad and how he said, I wish I would have done it different. And in a way, Billy is there and that picture is there to maybe also help people not just honor him, but maybe honor the fact that hey guys, every day is a day that you walk out the door and we don't know. And so why not make every day a great one? Let's make sure that you have that connection with your family. Let's make sure that you live a good life and why that resilience is so important. And so it's not just honoring him, but it's honoring the fact of this mix of we don't know when that day is coming. You leave and we don't know you're coming back as a family, and resilience is such a big part of that connection that you have with your family in your life. Yeah. So it's such a great mix to be able to do that. I'm so glad that you were able to find that picture and that it works. So when y'all see the book, when you see the book, you'll know the story now. So yeah, very much.
Yeah.
So.
And like I said, I have yet to mention that the book's coming out without mentioning the story and without going, okay, well, they're going to see my humanity, which is fine. But
absolutely.
But I try to put it at the end of the presentation. So I'm not doing it.
That's what I was fixing to do was wipe my nose. And I'm like, do I have a tissue here? I do somewhere. But it's moving too. Let me shift just a little bit because we'll talk at the end about when the book's coming out. I mentioned earlier about you teaching a program called ASAP.
Yeah.
I got to meet the whole crew that, I don't know, founded ASAP. Is that how I want to say it? And I think that this program that is being taught to peer support is an amazing program that you're sharing. You talked about teaching peer support so they can touch people to, if they don't have to go into mental health. Talk briefly about what ASAP is.
Okay. That's going to be a feat, is to try to be brief about it. But yeah, I'll give an elevator pitch and then you can ask questions. So ASAP stands for Acute Stress Adaptive Protocol. We all love acronyms, and this is just another one. And it's used to be called the Modified GTEP. So again, another acronym, the Group Traumatic Episode Protocol, which is an EMDR. GTEP is an EMDR for groups that clinicians historically have been providing. So if there was some major event and there wasn't enough bandwidth for the clinician to see people on an individual basis, or it made more sense based upon collective cultures or other, or just kind of cohesiveness of the group, the clinician would do the group traumatic episode protocol, which was created by Dr. Ellen Shapiro, no relation to Francine Shapiro, the one that created EMDR. And Sonny Pervetto modified that to the first responder profession, modifying the language, a little bit of the layout, a little bit of how much time anyone was spending and going into the traumatic event and thinking about and reprocessing the traumatic event so that it would be more suitable for the first responders as recipients. Then also created a lot of safety around it, a lot of grounding and emotion regulation and safety, so that peer supporters and chaplains, non-licensed and even licensed clinicians could administer this to first responders, and it would be more in line with that culture. So I'm going to back up and tell you how I came to ASAP in the first place, because I think this is incredibly important piece of the story, is that I had been working with an individual that someone had tried to kill many years earlier, and he had a peer support team, he had a citizen team, and they had all the debriefings and the one-on-ones and all the other things that typically occur when someone tries to kill an officer. And he had all those things, but he did not have EMDR. He did not even know EMDR existed. And so 4 years later, he's struggling pretty mightily. And he comes to see me just because I was a first responder clinician, not because I was an EMDR clinician. And I told him about EMDR and why we use it. And EMDR, for those that may not know what it is, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is another mouthful, which is basically, it's a process that mimics REM sleep. So when we have rapid eye movement sleep, our eyes spontaneously move back and forth as they're processing the drama and the trauma of the day. So 5 acronyms later, EMDR is mimicking REM sleep, and ASAP is meant to be a peer support version of that. And so this officer, I'm working with him on EMDR, and he gets his disturbance level down to a 0 on a 0 to 10 point kind of pain scale. It comes down one day, it comes down to 0. And he's very relieved, and he's tearful as he's relieved. And he asked me the question why nobody told him about EMDR earlier, like 4 years earlier. And I was like, well, this is an unanswerable question. I don't know why they didn't do that. I stammer stepped to, my best to answer what was probably a rhetorical question, but I wanted to answer anyway. And then the next question he asked me is, he said, what are you going to do about it? I was like, oh yeah, no. I was just like, oh shit. So it's like, all right. And so again, I stammer stepped and stumbled and said, well, I've been telling peer supporters about EMDR. I talk about it all the time. I wrote an article on it. It's in my book. And everything I said fell short, because Cindy, if I had done, or we had done, because it's not all on me, if we had done our job, he would have heard about that before then, right? If we had stepped up enough, he would have known about it. He wouldn't have been introduced to it 4 years after he probably really needed it. And so I took to the internet and said, okay, what are other people doing to get EMDR out to first responders earlier? And that's when I found Sonny Pervetto and found the ASAP and saw that he was teaching peer supporters how to do this. And I was like, well, how the hell is that safe? I've been an EMDR clinician for a number of years. That doesn't seem responsible. Is that safe? And so I start reading. I was like, oh gosh, there's some actual versions of this being done in other places around the world where there's a shortage of mental health people, and the people in the field are in the prime position to do this, what we would call psychological second aid. And so I was like, wow, okay, so the World Health Organization talks about task shifting and task sharing. And I was like, okay, well, they probably know something about health and ethics and treatment and trauma and this kind of stuff. So maybe just a little bit. And so I reached out to Sonny and asked him 1,000 questions. He gave me 1,010 answers. And I remember thinking, holy shit, this guy's a former trooper. And so not only is he culturally competent in EMDR in the trauma world, but he's actually culturally competent in the first responder world. So then COVID-19 hit, so we couldn't do anything about training. But once that cleared up, then I brought him out to Oregon, him and his team out to Oregon, and I brought him out 2 more times. They trained at this point over 200 peer supporters, chaplains, and first responder clinicians in the ASAP protocol. And so, and then after that, some of the work that I'd done with him and some of the recommendations I was making or other kind of suggestions, he said, gave me the only other spot in the US to be able to teach. And so I teach mostly on the West Coast and the South. He teaches on the East Coast and the North. But we can crisscross applesauce if an agency prefers that. But it's a very powerful 4-day course where we teach peer supporters a lot about the things I'm talking about, the science and the strategies of trauma. And the strategy we're teaching them is these strong emotion regulation skills, but then some of this kind of little micro processing, if you will, still staying within the domain of a first responder, a non-licensed, not jumping into anything that would be regarded as therapy, but is doing what has been responsibly done and researched around the world as a form of psychological second aid. And so that's what ASAP is. And as much as I describe the origin of it coming from a group protocol, it's actually done probably more often now as an individual protocol. It's like we have a chaplain that's done over 200 ASAPs, and most of them have been with individuals. So people come and ask it for it by name. And he just says, okay, you got 45 minutes, 50 minutes. And that's the beauty of it, is it takes very little time.
Yeah.
And he teaches them some grounding and regulation, and they practice some grounding and regulation. So that they start getting their nervous system queued up for the next thing, which is a little bit of trauma processing. And what we have found, and the last time I did an ASAP was a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks ago. And people maybe start out on, as 8s, 9s, and 10s on that disturbance scale, that kind of that psych pain scale of 0 to 10. And they're 3s and 4s 45 minutes later. And the research bears out that it can go that low that quickly. Not everybody. I mean, you still have some 5s and 6s, people carrying different loads. But then what they found is that they repeated it in these intensives, and they did it, again and again and again, that it was driving it down. And then if they would do the boosters, like once a month kind of, then it was staying down. And the reason why they needed the boosters was because you can drive the trauma and the distress down. But if you go back into the trauma and the distress, it's naturally going to go back up. Just like if you went to the dental hygienist and they took all the tartar off, but you kept eating, you're going to be putting the stuff back on. You don't just stop eating because you got a dental cleaning, and you don't just stop being exposed to trauma because you had ASAP. And so it's one of those things like showers or dental cleanings that they're better when you repeat them. And this is just one of those things. But what's beautiful is peer supporters sometimes do this, and it's a standalone. And other times, and I've had this happen several times, where one of the peer supporters that I'm attached to their agency says, hey, we need to get someone in. And they're already seeing one of the clinicians in your office, and they have an appointment next Tuesday. It's Thursday night. They're in a bad way. They're not suicidal, but they're in a bad way. And I said, take them through phase 1, because there's 2 phases. Take them through the phase 1, which is that emotional regulation while you're there with them. And they're like, yeah, I'm going to talk to them every day. I'm just going to take them through that every day. And it'll drive them there. And then they'll send me a message. They're a 4 and they had been a 10. So by the time they come into the therapist office,
right,
and instead of already kind of being up here and hadn't been up there for the whole weekend and maybe drank and kicked the dog and, smacked the, kid or whatever, they are not, everybody does that, but it's an extreme example. They're down. And so by the time they come in to see the clinician, in this case, they're ready to just keep getting on to work. They're not having to be assisted in regulation, because the peer supporter did that with them, and then they can do that for themselves.
Which is the whole point.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is the ASAP program. I think, because we're talking about resilience. And when you told me about the ASAP, by the way, I saw your post on LinkedIn about doing ASAP, and I'm like, what is this? And I had the same response of like, what is going on here? Why we're teaching lay people EMDR? Like, what is this happening? And then I started looking into it, and then you and I talked, and I'm like, this is brilliant and that there's a program that can be taught to peer support to help with the resilience, that it, once again, it bridges that gap between the mental health and what our first responders need. So if you're interested, if people are interested in the ASAP program, should they just contact you? Should they
can go to ASAP Institute, and perhaps I can give you links to put.
We'll put links
show notes. Yeah.
In the show notes below. Let me shift one more time. With the book and with your revision, this is going to be a weird question. What is your most favorite or most impactful part of the book that you think, man, people have to read this part?
Gosh, yeah, that's a hard one. Yeah, I really think the recalibrating the nervous system piece, there's a chapter, and I can't remember what number. It's odd enough, I can't remember what number it ended up being. I know what the content is. I don't know the placement of it. And because when people can learn to recalibrate that nervous system, then it improves 2 paths. It doesn't just improve the mental health path, which in turn improves relational paths and other things like that, but it also improves the performance path. And then the more they perform at high levels, then like in a good way, then the better the mental health. And so I think in some regards, when you look at some of and I'm doing a lot of training on this, the recalibrating the nervous system, I think that's such a big piece of it. And that's the section I'm really really was excited to write, and because it's talking about how to, we can sometimes be, or first responders can sometimes be, or people that are stressed, sympathetic dominant, which is to say, their go system is going a lot faster than their slow system, right?
Mhm.
And so their parasympathetic nervous system. And so, and it's not because the sympathetic is just so big, that's part of the equation, it's just so overdeveloped, but the parasympathetic system is so emaciated and underdeveloped.
Mm.
And if we can recognize, and these two systems are part of the autonomic, or they are the autonomic, auto being self, nomic being like metronome, kind of balancing. And when it's not in balance, we're not well in any regard, performance wise, relation wise, health, there's health consequences, there's sleeping, all kinds of things. And so that's the chapter, that's the section I'm most excited about people seeing, because again, it puts the tools in their hands to go and really accessible. Again, this isn't, I'm going to learn to levitate through some third eye that I'm coming in contact with and opening, it's not
right. No, I got it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's it.
I'm excited for the book to come out. I have already pre-ordered mine. You put it out there and I immediately went, yes, please. And I bought it on Amazon. When is it coming out? When is the new one coming out?
It's funny because I actually had to go to Amazon to see, because my publisher will tell me at one date and then I'll go to Amazon. It'll be something else. So it's either September 28th or 29th. It depends on which website you look at, because it's on the publisher, the Routledge, I think Routledge.com website as well. So I just go based upon Amazon. But I'm also, once I get because I'm supposed to get a bulk of them at the end of September, when it hits, then I'll also make them available at my website if anybody wants them signed, because I know sometimes that's important to people. They want one signed and sent to someone specifically. And so I'll have them probably at the end of September, beginning of October myself, so that I can sell them, or you can go through Amazon, or 28th or 29th, I think.
Okay. Then if they want a signed copy and go to your website, what is your website?
It is firstresponderpsychology.com.
And I'll put that link below. Anything else that people need to know in order to connect with you?
No, because I think I'm on LinkedIn. I have a business Facebook page, First Responder Psychology. And then just my website has my email and contact information there. So I think those are some pretty safe places. I go into at least the social media like once or twice a day just to check to see if anything's up, because I have occasionally gotten some, I want therapy, and I'm like, whoa, okay.
Whoa.
Okay.
Any final words that you want to leave with everybody else as they're listening?
Yeah, I can't think of anything in particular other than to say that I hope they'll pick up the revised expanded edition. I hope that they will find the value in it. And if there's clinicians listening, and I hope there are, I hope that you'll pick it up, even if you know all the things that I was talking about and you're like, yeah, no kidding, I know that stuff, that you'll pick it up to read it, to see some of the kind of cultural norms relating to first responders, I think sometimes, or some of the challenges. So I think that's just a good source for clinicians that maybe even know that the woo-woo as well could also find some value in that. So
if you want to know how woo-woo is woe, make sure that you pick up Stephanie's book. So her book, again, is Increasing Resilience in Police and Emergency Personnel, Strengthening Your Mental Armor. I will put the link to her website down below where you can get that, or I'll probably also put the link to Amazon so people can pre-order it if they want to do that there. This book, like I said, I know I preach about her book on a daily basis, on a regular basis, maybe not daily, but guys, this is a book that you need to get as a first responder family. I would say this is one of those valuable books that can definitely impact your relationship, your resilience, and have you more balanced, that you can do the work to connect. And Stephanie, once again, thank you for the work you do. And thank you again for coming on. I appreciate it so much.
Yep. Thanks you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Until next time, guys, y'all keep it code 4. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about the podcast or Cindy, check out code4couples.com. All intellectual property rights owned by CRLD2 Ventures, LLC, are protected by the firm of 9mm, 45 ACP, 5.56mm, and 12 gauge.